Lee. Great. Rossi from AstraZeneca.
So thanks, Samir, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation. Couple of remarks. I've most recently been running the global health economic market access and what we call real world evidence, so epidemiological group at AstraZeneca, and before that was at Genentech, and before that at Amgen. Spent 12 years over here in the US in the reimbursement environment and clinical drug development environment. At the moment, I'm now back in the UK and on a sort of daily basis in conversations with a number of health technology assessment agencies, whether they be Germany, France, or the UK that you heard about from Dr. Thomas. So I think a couple of things. One, I think we're clearly in an age of innovation here, particularly I think in cancer. If we look at the number of drugs that FDA approved last year, 45, I think it was, that is a significant increase over and above what have been really over the last sort of decade, probably sort of 2 decades. And if you look at the types of products, many of those, if not the majority, are first in class, certainly very significant sort of benefits. Many are in cancer. And I think that innovation is something that from the point of view of patients, the point of view of the industry, and I think the whole health system is something to be very much welcomed. So the question that we really have is IO different to how we think about value assessment? We get an outcome with a therapeutic intervention. It costs something, and we've got to make an evaluation about whether that cost is worth the benefit, both at a patient level and I think at a system level, a societal level. And I'd like to sort of posit that I think that there are some differences, but many of the differences or many of the challenges are not necessarily significantly materially different from some of the challenges that we've already had in terms of how do we think about high cost, high value therapeutics and how we sort of manage those things. So it may be the confluence of these things coming together that makes IO very different. And I think here I'm really talking about things like the checkpoint inhibitors, which I think are different from how we think about cell-based and cell-mediated treatments, where I think we do have, as we've heard over the last 2 days, I think a real challenge, a very good challenge, but a real challenge to how we think systematically about both drug development, regulation, and reimbursement of these almost, I won't call them sort of reagents associated with autologous cell treatments, but it's a very different model to, I think, the way in which we've traditionally thought about sort of drug development, regulation, and reimbursement. So if we think about 2 areas, one, I think, is the actual therapy itself and the uncertainty associated with that therapy. So in a lot of the conversations we have right now with HTA agencies, with payer organizations, it's around not so much the price, although the price is obviously a central theme, but it's how do we sort of understand what we're getting for that money? And I think uncertainty here in the immuno-oncology setting is a clear conversation that we need to have. We've heard already today about challenges with endpoints and the interpretation of endpoints. We've heard about the appropriateness or lack of appropriateness of surrogates. We've heard about the non-proportionality in terms of when we look at time to event analyses, whether they be on progression or whether they be on overall survival. We know that we have a number of single-arm trials using these durable responses as a way to sort of define value. We know that many of these durable responses take a lot of time to observe. So how many patients are still on treatment and in remission at 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, when we look at some of those original melanoma data? How do we sort of define a value proposition when we know that a subgroup of patients are basically going on treatment for that long? How do we know the durability of that response? How do we understand the dose and scheduling that's associated about cessation of treatment, not just sort of initiation or titration of treatment? These are all questions that have a direct impact, obviously, on patients, on clinical outcomes, but they also have a direct impact on costs. And I think that's the conversation that we need to start to think about. And that's before we get to combining a number of these different agents together, where we see clearly the biology is telling us to go in a particular direction. And how do we basically think about that in terms of drug development? How do we think about that in terms of patient management? How do we think about that in terms of access? The second area that I think we need to think about around this uncertainty question is what are the system impediments that we have? What we can see clearly is that we have multiple indications for these therapies, sometimes at different doses, certainly at different durations, certainly with different outcomes necessarily. And yet we ask for a single price per unit, per vial. And how do we think about a value-based pricing system in the context of that evolving evidence? And then if you add to that the concept of combinations, I think you get very quickly to some needs for us to be able to allocate a price-value relationship on an indication-specific basis rather than on a specific vial. I think you also get the questions of generalizability because, as we've heard, the regulators, who I think are being very flexible, are accelerating many of these drugs to the market with surrogate endpoints based on early stage data. And then the question comes, what's the generalizability of that? And I think we'll get even more questions when we start looking at first-line treatments, because we're going to have crossover sequencing questions that we're going to get into, which will again confound our ability to really determine the value proposition through formal or standard approaches that we've used traditionally. So I think if we start thinking about solutions, one is, I think, how do we use these early access programs to ensure patients have access, but also to collect information and data for these long-term outcomes? And how do we basically have shared, I think, risk management in that regard? How do we think about the adaptive designs for trials, which Simon talked about yesterday? I was here, how many years ago? Almost 8 years ago, and we talked about the learning healthcare system. And the role of outcomes-based agreements. I think that needs to come back. How do we think about outcomes-based agreements? Because I think ultimately we need to get to a place where, instead of being sort of the pharma product-centric or the regulator population-centric or the payer system-centric or the physician patient-centric view of the world, and slightly different from each stakeholder's perspective, we need to have an integrated view with the patient at the center of it. And I think that really is around how do we do indication-based pricing, how do we actually contract around outcomes, and how do we set up national systems for increasing understanding, whether that be in terms of genetic or pathology information, how does that link back to both clinical trial and real world use, and how do we use that to sustain a way to evolve our thinking for the best use of these therapies? Because I think what's very clear is that this level of innovation is something that is clearly very significant for patients. It's very significant for our industry. It's very significant, I think, for delivery of healthcare. And I think we need to work out how we have this sustained.